No.
No, but I just meant because of the attendance.
Will be an easy audience for you. Well, let's just start. Hi, I'm Natalie. I'll be your host today. Rich will present to us the relevant technologies for CMS-0057 and CMS-0053. If you have any questions, please leave them for after the presentation. For the people joining online, you can use the Whova Q&A tab. So we can go over those after the presentation, and Rich can also answer them after the presentation. Yes.
Thank you.
Rich, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Rich Almeida, and let's advance my slide here. There we go. I'm a Firely server technical consultant for Firely, and one of my jobs is to deep dive IGs and ensure that our software is either compliant or needs to be compliant. So I'll write up a specification or assist in creating tickets. So what I've done here for this presentation, I've basically done that job for you and for me, and then I'm going to present that today on CMS-0057 related APIs and all the IGs that are contained within. So let's talk about the agenda. I'll highlight, like I said, the relevant technologies used in CMS-0057. I will provide some insight into whether or not you can use newer versions of the IGs. I'll also focus mainly on the technology, operations, behaviors, and any new software that's involved in these IGs. I'll talk about maybe never implemented to date items and interesting profiles that you might need to know about. Also, I'll discuss briefly CMS-0053 and how that regulation applies. But I'm not going to cover how the workflow works for these IGs. I'll mention maybe briefly in a sentence what it's for, but we only have a few minutes, so I got to stick to just the technology. And then there's many common dependencies across all of these IGs: US Core, Smart on Fire, terminology, bulk data export. I might mention a couple as we go, but really it's just to highlight that it's being used or used differently. So CMS and the use of the updated implementation guide. So there's an outstanding question that I've been asked a few times actually is, can we use the newer version of the implementation guide? And if you know about CMS-0057, it says use maybe Karen version 1. Can I use Karen version 2? Well, the answer, read this later. The answer is yes. As long as when you implement, it does not disrupt the end user's ability to access the data. So you can use Karen 2.0, say for example, but if you discover that it is not compatible with Karen 1, which I'll tell you it is, it's okay, at least for this one I know, then you can go ahead and use 2.0. But if you were to implement a newer version of the IG and it changes the entire functionality, then CMS would like you to use the original recommended implementation guide that they've outlined. And just to prove this, DaVinci here has already proposed many times over to allow updated IGs. CMS has sort of accepted that in the regulation language like I showed here, but we could read it later. And so for this presentation, we're going to assume that we're going to use the latest IGs. So that's what I've deep dived for you and what I'm going to present today. And unless modified in the final rule, then we're just going to, I think we should all proceed as if the newest IG is going to be used. With that said, this message will self-destruct at the end of this presentation because literally every day I go in to these IGs, and you can see here, commits on June 2nd. Every day something is changing. The IGs are very fluid, so even what I present right now may change before the end of the day. So you should be familiar by now with the IGs that are involved in CMS-0057. You have probably seen this at something, at a WGM, a DaVinci presentation. This is each IG, the minimum version that's recommended, and how it applies to the different APIs. What I've done is I've gone through and I've reorganized this information for you so that maybe it's a little bit more straightforward, because it's kind of hard. It's like, is it used here in this one? I've kind of fixed it a little bit for us. So here you can see it's the same exact information, but I've created this little sidebar that we're going to use throughout the presentation, so that way you can track what I'm talking about, which IG, and where it applies to which API. And then I also have a little bit of extra information on there about when it's going to be released. So here in the big box, the big teal box, you can see that the payer-to-payer API encompasses Karen Blue Button, DaVinci PDEX, PDEX US Drug Formulary, and coverage decisions exchange. It's not so clear from the other slide, I think, so I've reorganized this data here. And then you can see how the other IGs that we're going to cover slide by slide apply to each API. So let's start right away. Caring for Blue Button. Off to the right, Caring for Blue Button will be STU 1 and 2. It is complete already. It's not being actively worked on. You can sort of trust it at this point. And so I'll just point out a couple nice things about it. One of the things is that there's this explanation of benefit search parameter, star. What does star mean? It actually means that it's not just payer, it's not just coverage, it's anything. So you can say include star, which means go ahead and give me, I want everything that you have, coverage, payer, care team, there's a couple others, when I ask for the includes for an explanation of benefit. So it's something that we haven't really seen in many other IGs. They're out there, but it's not in any IGs that are for the US specific, US core type things. Another one is the status 400 for invalid search parameter. I know a lot of fire servers out there that if you have an invalid search parameter, maybe it ignores it. Maybe it just brings back all the resources. But in this case, you actually need to return a 400 if you implement this IG. And you can see, just I'll highlight again on the right, the APIs are in white that this applies to. Next one, PDEX, which is actually Da Vinci Payer Data Exchange. Here you'll see a little bit more information. I've gone through and collected all the dependencies as they exist in GitHub today, or well, a couple days ago. I'll try to explain each one in brief, and you'll see more of this type of slide as we go forward. So PDEX relies on Atrex, which is actually an overarching foundational guide that's been implemented in many other IGs. So it has very specific commonalities that we're going to be using throughout many of the IGs, for example, member match and the coverage profiles. So it's like inheriting an IG just so you can reuse functionality that's exactly the same. It also has National Directory of Healthcare and Provider Services. There are some very specific profiles for MTLS, which are payer-to-payer. That's why NDH is involved. And I already mentioned member match is an operation. It comes from Atrex. There's also a shall that I thought was interesting to reference here. docref shall reference to CCDs. So if you implement PDEX, then you must be able to put out the CCD from the docref operation. And again, I'm not going to highlight this every time, but in this case, patient everything and bulk data export is used for exchanging the member data. Lastly, technology, CDS hooks. I hope you've heard of it. If not, it's this really awesome way of running an API that's not FHIR. You can execute FHIR through a CDS hook. You can execute maybe a formulary lookup or any type of other EHR data, collect that all together into what's called a card, and then present that in an EHR to a provider or to a patient or whatever in a portal. And so this requires on technology for that. And in this case, it's to start the exchange between the provider and the health plan. So the health plan would implement this and maybe be like a smart app with some CDS hooks, and the provider would query the health plan to start initiating a member match. Next up is drug formulary. This is where we start to get to, I don't know what STU it's going to be, and the time frames are maybe July. The timeline, if you go look at this, is they want to do it in July, but they don't know what STU. There's a couple like 01 version, and maybe we'll go to 2. So you just got to keep an eye on these things. But what I'll tell you about it is that right now it relies on PDEX PlanNet, which we'll talk about after. Also has Atrex involved, bulk data export, graph definition, which maybe you haven't heard of or used very much already. That's the ability to run like a include search, like in a previously stored way. Also, towards the end of the IG is this little draft explanation where we might use bulk data export, and that's where that graph definition comes in. So I'm going to run through these. Da Vinci Payer Coverage Exchange. We have 5 minutes for questions or for my presentation. Okay. PCDE, July again, we're not sure. This is payer-to-payer, Atrex. A lot of commonalities you're starting to see here. So when you ask yourself, as an EHR vendor or a FHIR vendor, Which ones do I need to do? Well, it's starting to look like you kind of need to do a lot of these because they rely on each other. So if you implement this, you also need to implement PDEX, member match, task workflow, prior authorization, which we'll get to in a minute. And I won't run through all of this stuff as we wane on time, but again, CDS hooks, coverage requirements. Discovery is basically to exchange the coverage plan requirements from payer to providers. Here's some new things you haven't seen yet. Structured data capture, that's for populating the CDS hooks that I talked about before. Again, another commonality. And then HREX for the claim response profile. And then there's an interesting thing with CRD, which has two different capability statements, one for the server and one for the client. So DTR, this is where we get into PARDD, which is the prior authorization and burden reduction type. We also have structured data capture here, which is an adaptive questionnaire profile. There are behaviors, like the coverage resource contains payer endpoint extensions. That's something we haven't seen before. And then operations, very specifically questionnaire package, which will be, the input will be coverage orders from the CRD, which we just saw. And then the output will be the questionnaire, the logic for CQL, which we're now introducing now as a new technology and basically a requirement. Or it could be FirePath or xQuery, but it kind of seems like it's going to be up to the receiver. So you're going to need to maybe implement all of these. And it's a little piece of CQL, so it doesn't need to be this giant engine, it doesn't look like, but that will be something that will be required in this. So in this case, the technology is CQL execution and CDS hooks again. DaVinci prior authorization support. This is the last IG in CMS-0057. It uses CDEX, which was unexpected, but it's for the exchange of the communication request method. So when you want to know whether or not the X12 in this case is pending or whatever, you can use this to send the supplemental data for maybe, you know, they asked, I need more encounter information, I need more, you know, what medications, whatever it is, then this is how you would find that out and send that data via CDEX. And that uses the claim inquiry and then claim submit from CDEX. And it's just a variant of it. So there may be some, at this point, I can't tell the difference what the variant is, but there will be some differences between the standard claim inquiry and submit as to why it applies, how it applies, I mean, for prior authorization. Last thing is the technology for converting X12 to and from Fire. This seems to be a requirement right now. DaVinci has sort of a ability to test without it right now. This is not a final rule. Maybe it will become a rule, maybe it won't. Maybe you don't have to convert the X12. Maybe you can ship it along as a binary resource. But just know if you need to do prior authorization support, you need to keep an eye on this type of thing. Lastly is PlanNet. PlanNet is basically just a standard approach for requesting and receiving provider information and insurance plans. So the nice thing about this is it's built on, not as a dependency, but built on the original validated healthcare directory. So they actually borrowed profiles and code systems. So it's something that you can be familiar with, you can look up, and obviously when the IG is complete, then you can just use it as it is. But it's also, you can start looking at VHDR now and start to implement this as needed. Here I've created this matrix. This is quite an experience trying to get this to work. And here you'll see whether or not there's a dependency on another IG and whether or not it's inferred, and that inferred would be, you know, maybe PCDE requires PDEX, and PDEX therefore uses NDH, and that's what would be an inferred dependency. So you can use this to help you determine if you're interested in like provider directory. Well, I need to go look at VHDIR, or if you're doing one of the bigger APIs, then there might be many things like HREX and subscriptions that you have to implement in your Fire server or your EHR, whichever it be. Lastly, 0053, 1 minute, is attachments. So I'm just going to start with the crux of this, is that this is not being recommended as proposed. DaVinci is recommending the withdrawal of 0053 in favor of CDEX, and CDEX is a way to exchange information, including X12s, how I kind of mentioned quickly in prior authorization. And so instead of putting these digital signatures in CDA format and everything that 0053 dictates, we would rather use Fire. Wouldn't that be nice, right? So that's what the industry is recommending, particularly with DaVinci, and hopefully we actually do that. Okay, I made it. 1 minute.
Yes, you
Are there any
did.
questions?
There are no questions online, so
Okay.
I'll first move to the. Sorry. See. Okay. So they're asking the dates you have mentioned on the top right. Are those dates when these IG will be normalized, or by that time payers need to implement?
Those days are when they're going to say that this is going to be the STU number. So they haven't even versioned some of them yet. They're just GitHub repositories.
Yeah.
And so if it's at, like, say, I'll just use Karen because I can't remember these numbers, but you'll go from Karen 2 to 3 maybe. The July or the date that I put up there will be the number that we know. But there's a couple draft specifications in between some of these, so we're not sure if they're going to go from, you know, point 1 and call it 1 or what have you. So I actually don't have an answer. What I would say is watch the GitHub repository, and the date that goes along with it is coming out from DaVinci. Stay abreast of those presentations that they give every month, and you'll have a better idea of whether it's July and what the STU will be.
Okay, I hope that answers the question. Anyone else in the room or online that has a question? I actually did have a question. You had the matrix. It's a very nice overview to see when to use what IG. This is something you made, I assume.
I did.
Where can implementers find this?
In this presentation.
Okay, okay, so it's nowhere that implementers can
No,
find.
but I'm glad you asked, because I think that I should keep this up to date and maybe see if we can put it somewhere that someone can track. So maybe let's think about that, and maybe we can put it on Firely's website or something.
For example. Okay. Anyone else? Will Firely Fire Server implement these fire operations? Question mark.
Yes, we will.
Probably the follow-up question is how soon?
Yes, I know. What's the roadmap? I really can't answer that question now. I know I actually talked about this beforehand. We're going to focus on obviously what's low-hanging fruit, and then also what our customers are asking for.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. If there are no other questions, then I think we can round off. If the people online still want to put in some questions into the Q&A, then feel free to do so. Rich will be able to reply to them after the presentation. Give Rich a round of applause, and thank you for your attention, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.